Okay, so this is Baroness Lucia for Ealdormere at Home. And would you like to introduce yourself, kind sir?
I'm Seigneur Baudouin de Domrémy, working out of my house in Burlington, Ontario.
Nice. So I hear you brew some mead sometimes.
Yeah, I've been doing it, I think, since about 1998, I think. It's been a while that I've been doing it. I got into it actually because once upon a time, a long time ago, um, I attended an arts and sciences event in Ramshaven that was, they called it Guilds Day. And they asked everybody to bring something that they'd made or whatnot. And at that time, I was doing kit wines, so I thought, hey, I'll bring a couple bottles of wine, and stick it on the table with everything else. And of course, I had no intention of having it judged, but the judges came around anyways. And then one of them said, "Well, you should try like doing something." More original than this, because this is just. And I said, well, yeah, sure, I guess I could get into it. And then they mentioned mead making. I thought that sounds like fun. So then it took a while before I managed to secure a pail of honey, and once I did, I started going with it, and have been doing batches ever since. And I mean, typically the only time I don't really drink it usually in the course of the year, except for at SCA events, but I always enjoy having it at SCA events. It just adds an extra flavor to the day.
So what is mead?
Mead is any brew that you make with honey and water. So it's fermented honey and water. There's a variety of different ways of making it, different types of mead that you can make. The just straight honey and water is sort of a plain hydromel, but if you add spices to it to give it various different flavors, that's called a metheglin. I've made a number of metheglins. The first mead that I made actually was called Halfdan's Viking Mead. And after I made it, the first time I tried it, it was not great. So I gave away like half of the bottles. Well, lo and behold, 5 years later, it was ambrosia. It was, yeah. I'm like, oh crap, I guess I shouldn't have given away all that mead, because it actually, it ages in such a weird way. It's not like wine. Part of the thing about honey is a very good preservative itself. It's an antiseptic, and like they've even proven that you can use it on cuts at 50% strength diluted with water, and it'll act as an antiseptic on cuts. They've used it to preserve meats for a long time in history, and part of that preservative process, that the natural enzymes that come from the bees and whatnot, helps to keep the honey wine for a much longer time than you get out of a grape from a wine. So metheglin is one of those meads. The other meads that I've made a lot of are melomels. So it's any time you blend honey and fruit. And there's some special names for some of those. So if you do honey, and instead of using water, you use apple cider, you get something called a sizer, which can be very, very good. I've made a few good sizers. And obviously the typical spices that you might consider adding to that would be a little bit of clove, a little bit of cinnamon. There's also a piment, which I haven't actually done any of, which is using grape juice and honey. So it's sort of like a half wine. There's also a rotomel that I've always wanted to try, which is where you take rose leaves, rose flower petals, and you mix that with your mead. And I think that would make a really spectacular mead. So it's sort of the next thing on my list of things I want to try. The other thing that I've done that doesn't have a special name to it, but I get black raspberries because they grow wild up in Dundas, just south of Greensville, where Don the Duckman lives. So if I head up there in like mid-June, the bushes are just covered in black raspberries. And I don't know if you've ever tasted a black raspberry. It's not the same as a regular raspberry. The flavor profile is completely different. It's sweet and lovely, and they're just an amazing concentration of color and flavor. So if I go up there and I pick for a few hours, I can get a couple kilograms, and I take that back, take those raspberries, and I've found one of the things that I've read about meads with fruit, you want to break down the cells, you want to lyse the cells so that you can release as much juice and flavor as possible. Well, you can do that with fruit sometimes by freezing it. Yeah. But you can also do that by just putting honey straight onto it, because the honey has got such a high concentration of sugar that it just causes the cells to release all their fruit and juices. So I've done that with the berries, and the only thing you have to be careful of is to avoid molds, which when as soon as you start to decrease the amount of sugar in the honey by adding something that's watery, you create a presence that no longer will prevent molds from growing. So you got to be careful with that. But then you take that honey and the berries and pour those all into a pail, and then top it up with water and add your yeast, and you get your fermentation going. And that particular mead concoction that I created with black raspberries, I called it Ben Dunforth Archer, because the first time I ever found those black raspberries was on the archery field that we were using up in Greensville. And so the first time I ever did it, I collected my black raspberries from the archery field. So I try to give all my meads a fun name.
So what is the range of alcohol concentration in this? Is it like a beer or like a wine, or is it like a whiskey?
Well, it depends on what you're doing, because you can make meads that have very low alcohol concentration, more like a beer. In fact, there is a type of mead that's made with along with beer base. So if you have a wort from the use of like barley or other types of grains that you would normally use in a beer, and you mix that with honey, you make something called a braggot. So you can make a mead. You can also make a quick mead where you're not fermenting it to dryness. You're fermenting it only to get it going, and it's you drink it a lot sooner than you would normally, and that can be a low alcohol level towards the 5% range. But you can ferment as dry as the yeast will tolerate. So it all depends on what yeast you're using. So there's a lot of things that you can do with researching how you're going to do your mead to determine what yeast you want to use. Now, typically I like the D47 yeast. It's actually a mead yeast. Okay. Because I find that it's a little hardier for being able to tolerate being in the honey, because the big problem with mead is honey doesn't have a lot of the nutrients that yeast typically needs to thrive. And if yeast isn't entirely happy, it'll still ferment, but it'll throw off flavors. Okay. So it generates like aldehydes and other chemicals that you don't necessarily want. And that means that your end product won't be drinkable as quickly as you'd hope. So meads that you shelve for a while, that'll die down, and then it becomes more like I said, ambrosia. Yeah. But if you want to reduce the amount of time that you're going to have to wait before you crack that first bottle and actually enjoy it, you want to try and make your yeast as happy as possible. And that's one of the things that I've found. Sometimes it's about making the yeast happy, and sometimes it's about what you added to the mead that either masks some of that off flavor or provides some of those nutrients to the yeast. So when I add the berries to the yeast for the black raspberry, I find that they do have some of the proteins that the yeast needs. I've also discovered that one of the things you can do is you can take like a nutritional yeast, right, and boil it so that you're killing it. You don't want it to ferment, but right, what you're doing is you're basically releasing all of those nutrients that are in the nutritional yeast to provide that additional source of protein and nutrients that the yeast that you're adding to it would get. I sort of liken that to in medieval times they may not have done that or thought of that, but there were other things that they had going for them. So if you were making mead in medieval times, it was something that you did like in big batches on a regular basis the entire facility would have been covered in natural yeasts from the fermentation process, because that's one of the things that they'll do is they'll take over that area. So you won't even really need to worry about finding a yeast to put into it. Like in medieval times, they just, would let it go. They'd probably take a little bit from their former batch and add it to the next batch. So the yeast just kept going.
So have you ever done a natural yeast ferment?
No, because I don't have it's not the yeasts that would just come from the ceiling in my back room would not, I wouldn't trust it.
Oh, fair.
I want if I'm going to spend all that money and all that time getting it going, I want to make sure that I'm going to get an end product that's drinkable. Maybe I might try it as an experiment, but that I'd do in a very small batch because I wouldn't want to waste that much honey. If I'm going to do a full carboy, and when I go whole hog, right? So when I started, I was doing full carboys, and people were like, "Why don't you do smaller batches?" I'm like, "Well, I don't have anything to make the smaller batch in. I've got carboys though, because I did winemaking, so I've got all the equipment for it." So if you're going to do a full carboy, you want about 15 pounds of honey, which
Where
is
would you get that much honey from?
Any apiary that provides honey will sell it in bulk. The problem is that sometimes it's more expensive than others. Like if you go down to Rosewood, which is a meadery and winery, they'll sell you bulk batches of honey, but it's going to cost you an arm and a leg. If you can find a private apiary who just makes a little bit of honey on the side, they'll sell you a pail probably for $40. There's also an apiary at the University of Guelph. It's their bee house. It's where they do the apiculture courses. So they've got professors in apiculture there, and people learn all about bee husbandry. It's fascinating. It's amazing if you ever got the chance to go and actually see them pull up a hive. Like the professor will come out with a group of students, and you'll all sit around the hive, and he'll crack it open and pull out he'll say, "There's the queen," and then he brings the whole frame over. "Does anyone want to touch them?" You can put your hand right on the backs of the bees and feel them, because they're calm, they've been smoked. And on top of that, he knows how to, when he picks his queens and breeds his bees, he breeds them for a lower level of aggressiveness, because aggressive bees are not a good thing.
No.
I mean, it might be good for the bees, but it's not good for the apiculturalist. So yeah, I got to do that actually a couple of years ago, part of the Science Writers and Communicators of Canada's annual meeting. I got to go to the bee house there, and he was selling pails of honey from them for $40. And I said, "Done, I'll take one." And I carted it's heavy. It's heavy stuff. Carted it back to my car and tossed it in and left it there for the weekend. And then when I got home, I started coming up with ideas about what I wanted to do with it. So, but yeah, you can, Dutchman's Gold will sell them. They've got a store just north of here, up Guelph line. So it's like partway between here and I guess Rockwood, sort of somewhere halfway in between there. You can look it up, but yeah, there's places that do beekeeping and sell honey all over the place. And if you can, just keep your eyes out and talk to people. And if you find somebody who raises their own bees and has excess honey that they'd be willing to sell you, that's a good way to do it. And the nice thing about it too is, like I like doing a kit wine from time to time just to have some table wine on hand. We're big wine drinkers here. We also buy, the more expensive bottles, which are always better than the kit wine. But the kit wine's a good table wine, but it's got no creativity to it. You're doing something that was already pre-prepared. You're just throwing it together. It's like cooking in a TV dinner versus when you make mead, you're actually making something original that's your own artistry, really. You come up with, you can follow recipes and whatnot, but you still have to mind the thing. You have to, make sure that you're following all the best practices, and, you can come up with new ideas about what you want to mix into it, and follow advice that says, maybe if you add some lemons, it'll increase the acidity, which would be better for the yeast. And then you can give that a try, and you tweak it as you go along, and you sort of learn the ins and outs. And when you're done, you've got something that you actually made yourself. I mean, even if you're following a pattern and sewing a piece of garb that, you know, somebody else has done 1,000 times, you still made that thing yourself from scratch.
Right.
It's the same thing with the mead. You're making it from scratch rather than, you know, throwing something into the microwave that came in a box.
Are there medieval recipes to follow, or is it?
Lots. The best place to start with learning medieval recipes is the Closet of Sir Callum Digby Opened. It's
Right.
available on Gutenberg, so it's one of the, it's been scanned in, so you can go online and find it, and you can go through the whole thing. It has listings of all kinds of ingredients. So if you ever wanted to try, you know, mixing a few different things together, and you're like, would they have done this in the Middle Ages? You can go and look and say, oh yeah, they have all these ingredients they would have had access to. So sure, somebody would have probably thrown this together at some point. So it's good for documenting that you're using medieval ingredients and they were available during that time frame, and you're throwing it together the way somebody who would have been trying to create something back then would have done. The one thing that I would say though is almost all of the stuff in there that I've read through, he boils the honey and the water. And I really do think that this is because the water was terribly contaminated back then. It's why everybody drank all day long. They had short beers in the morning with their breakfasts, right? It's because the fermentation process, it helps to kill off anything else, any spoilage organisms that are in there. And it means you're not going to get sick from drinking the water, right? But you're still getting the water that your body needs to function, although the alcohol probably not so great, but that was the least of the things that they poisoned themselves with back then. So when you boil honey, I find you change the characteristic of the honey. It's why when you make mead, it's better to use unpasteurized honey. The pasteurization process, I'm not entirely clear as to why you would even do it, because honey itself is already antiseptic, and there's so much sugar there that nothing grows in it anyways.
I agree, absolutely.
And if you don't boil it, you retain those floral characteristics that come from the flowers that the honey was gathered from. When bees go to a flower and they sip on the nectar, they actually have two stomachs. The nectar goes into their basically their honey stomach, and what they do is, as they're flying back to the hive, they'll actually regurgitate a little bit of it so that the wind, as they're flying, helps to dehydrate it a little bit, and it gets rid of some of the moisture. And then when they get to the hive and they put it into the cells in the hive, the bees fan their wings on it to evaporate off as much moisture and concentrate down until it becomes honey. So what you're really tasting in honey, that the reason that honey has the flavor it does is because that is the direct stuff from the flower concentrated. And so all of those flavors of the floral notes that come from the flowers that the bee gathered it from are what you're tasting. And if you have that, if you retain that in your mead, I just feel that you're going to get a better end product with more characteristics that you would be able to say, oh, I can taste the honey note in there.
So what's the honey water ratio when you're making these things?
When I do a carboy is 23 liters. So it's the 15 pounds of honey and then topped up with water. I will boil some water to help melt the honey up, because you get it to mix. So a little bit of warm water, because also you want your must, which is the mead and water mixture. You want it to be a good temperature for the yeast, which is I think about 35. I'd have to double check that, but I always make sure, like I've got a thermometer that I double check to make sure that when the yeast goes in, it's not going to be so cold that the yeast will fall to the bottom and die.
Right. Yeah.
Because the yeast you're using, it's freeze-dried yeast. It's lyophilized, so it has to reconstitute. You can reconstitute your yeast. It's called pitching it, by putting it into a container with some sugar and water just to get it foaming, and then put it in. But I found that for the most part, the yeast packets that you buy from Lavalin, they're pretty good at just spreading it gently over the top, and it'll get going. I've found. Now, your mileage may vary. One other thing that I've also found, and this is through talking to the beekeeper at Rosewood, the guy who owns Rosewood Estates meadery, they ferment cold. So they actually have a cooling jacket on the outside of their 600 liter container, and it runs cool water through it to bring the temperature down. When you bring the temperature down, you don't want to bring it down so far that the yeast are unhappy, but you slow down the fermentation process. It takes longer, but you get a better end product. The flavors are better in the end product. So you can play around with temperatures, you can play around with acidity, you can play around with the sugar content. You can use it's a device called a hydrometer that you drop in and you spin it, and it actually bobs up and down in the water in the must based on the sugar content that's in your the must. And you can actually, based on that sugar content, you can tell what the specific gravity is, but you can also tell what the potential end alcohol content is. So if it ferments to completion and it says it will be 12% alcohol, then you know that you've got a 12% alcohol final product. And it's always good to be able to do that. That way, when somebody asks, do you know what the alcohol content is? You're like, yeah, I started it at this and it ended at this. So, so that's one way to do it. The other thing about yeast too is that every different yeast will have a different alcohol tolerance. So some of them will stop being able to handle the alcohol once it hits 12%. So if you start with your must and you're like, it has a potential of 17%, but the yeast stops at 12, 5% of leftover, you've got 5 leftover sugars in that, which will leave some of the honey flavor, the natural honey flavor behind, leave some of the sweetness behind. So you, instead of having a dry mead, you'll have a sweeter mead.
Okay. What piece of equipment is a must-have if you want to start doing mead on your own?
You have to have a fermentation vessel of some sort. I've seen people use all kinds of different things, from pop bottles to big water jugs. But for me, I have a primary fermenter, which is a big pail, and a carboy. And a carboy is just a plastic or glass shaped, basically like a barrel with a smaller area on the top. You also want to have something to keep the air from getting at your mead. So you want some kind of an airlock. So typically you can buy all this stuff really easily at any wine making place. So you go into a winemaking place and say, I'd like to get a primary fermenter, an airlock, and a carboy. They'll sell it to you for like 20, 30 bucks or something like that. You can also find people selling them on Kijiji that, oh, I've decided I'm getting out of this. I'm not going to do it anymore. And it's you can buy them for cheap that way. And then you can outfit yourself with the stuff that you need to get started. You want a big long spoon. They sell those too at the winemaking places, because it helps you mix in the honey and fish anything out that you put in there. And definitely have a logbook so that you can keep track of what you did when you started, what proportions of everything you put in, and then check off what you do along the way. One thing you're going to want to do is read a bit online about what some other people have done and what they recommend. One thing that you want to do regularly with your mead as it's going through the process, it's called racking. So what you want to have hoses so that you can siphon the mead, and we're talking food grade polypropylene hoses, right? So you can siphon the mead out of one container into another, because as the yeast ferments, it dies and the dead ones settle on the bottom. And if you leave the mead on the lees, which is what that's called, that those yeast will break down and they'll release stuff back into the mead that you may not want as a flavor characteristic. That flavor that you get from dead yeast is the flavor of bread. So if you don't want your mead to have a bready flavor, you're going to want to take it off those lees. It also helps to clarify it, because each time you take it off, there's less stuff that's in the mead itself. So each time you rack it off, you're removing some of those things that are falling out of the solution. If you're fermenting with fruits or with spices, a lot of times you can have a cloudiness that's there at the start, but you want to bulk age it, which means just leaving it in the carboy after it's finished fermenting to just sit there and settle, and then rack it off and then let it sit and settle. I've let mead sit in a carboy for half a year for 6 months before I bottled them. And it's still, I end up sometimes with a bottle, with the bottles after a year sitting on their side in the cupboard, just having a little bit of sediment all along the bottom, because it's just the natural process. I'm not like filtering stuff. I'm not, I mean, you can, if you want, you can buy the equipment to filter it. I don't know that would have been done in the Middle Ages. They may have passed it through a chunk of cotton or something like that to get rid of any impurities. I know that was may have been done with the must after they boiled the honey and the water together, because there'd be all kinds of crap that would come off on the surface. Usually they'd skim the surface and dump the seed.
Is there a food pairing you can recommend with your mead?
Well, it depends on what your mead is. I did a mead once that was heavy in cloves. I had been over enthusiastic when I was creating the Metheglin and added a little bit too much clove flavor to it, which made it a little difficult to drink for the first 5 years. But after that, it mellowed and melded and all the flavors came together. And that's the amazing thing, is how they change with time. That clove mead was like perfect for pork roasts. It was just meant for a heavy meat dinner. That being said, the Ben Dunforth Archer made with the black raspberries, I love to just drink that as an enjoyable, sipping drink around the campfire. Just during the day, it's a lovely flavor. But it would go well with it sort of does well as a stand-in for a red wine. Although a lighter red wine, because it does have that fruitiness and it has a sweet note to it. Although it is fermented to dryness, it still retains a little bit of that sweet note. But yeah, so you can make the meads as sweet or as dry as you want, and depending upon what flavor profile you have, sort of dictates what you might enjoy with it. But in general, like with anything, if you like it, do it. If you enjoy drinking the mead with a steak, then go right ahead. If that's what floats your boat, who am I to say no?
I know that you entered Mead into Pentathlon one year.
Yeah, I did Pent a few years ago. I was actually trying to gear up again to do that. I was kind of thinking about doing it this year, but then it turned out that Pent was on the other side of the province from me, and there was no way with the kids that I was going to make it out to it. But then it ended up getting canceled because of COVID. So I was sort of thinking of doing that again next time we have an ANS. So
do you have any advice for someone entering Mead?
Well, have your documentation together. Like I said, it's pretty easy to document a lot of things when you do the research online. There's lots of information out there, and that closet of Sir Kellam Digby was pretty good for. Yeah, I used black raspberries, and they would have had raspberries. So here you go. Make sure that you've kept good notes throughout the course of the process, so that you can say, here's what I did. It helps to tell the story. One thing that I learned, and this wasn't from Pent, but this was from Penzic one year, there can be a lot to be said about presentation. So consider what you're going to do to make your bottles stand out. People taste with their eyes before they ever taste with their mouths. So that's always a good thing. You also want to consider when you're doing your mead about what kind of concentrations you're going to use of things, because, and that's a bit of a learning game. You sort of learn as you go. Certain types of fruit you need a lot more of than others to be able to get that flavor profile. Strawberries in particular. Strawberries, it's a lovely flavor, but there's very little of it in each berry. And when you put them into a mead, if you don't have a significant quantity of them, and I couldn't tell you off the top of my head what that number is, but I could probably find it out by looking online. If you've got a significant quantity of them, then when you go to taste it, you'll be like, oh, strawberry, I get it. That's great. I made a strawberry mead a few years ago, and it was during, I was making it when Kayla was princess, so I called it Ealdormere Princess because it was pink. And when
Excellent.
I presented it to her, I said, "This bottle's still a little bit bubbly because I haven't beaten the bubbles out yet." And she said, "Pink things should be bubbly." So I left the bubbles in. That's the fun thing you can do with meads. Anything that's fermented with sugar is if you put it into the bottle while it's still got a little bit of sugar left, it'll ferment in the bottle and it'll carbonate itself. Now, that being said, I've had a few bottles that have popped their corks off and left big puddles on the floor. Had one hit me in the ankle. We were living in a place at one point where we didn't have a storage room. So the meads sat on the wine rack in the living room area, and I had a cork hit me in the ankle. I said, "What the heck was that?" Then I looked over. I'm like, "Oh, well, we just lost one."
Was that one bottle or 28 liters?
No, that was one bottle, just one bottle. Yeah, if you're not you have to be careful if you're going to do in bottle carbonation with just a regular cork, because you're not putting like any kind of a crimp cap to maintain the pressure, and the bottles aren't designed for the kind of pressure that you get in a champagne. So you don't want to overdo it. So you only want a little bit of residual sugar, so you get a little bit of residual fermentation. If you put too much, you're going to blow the back end off of those bottles and it'll just be a mess.
Do you have any strong opinions about like maple syrup meads or birch syrup meads? They're a little controversial.
They're good. I've tried the Acer Glens that John Spooner has done, and they're quite nice. I would hope if you're going to do an Acer Glen, I would personally prefer it to have residual sweetness. I find that if you ferment to dryness, that you lose the characteristic that you're hoping for from maple. At least that I'm hoping for. When I taste maple, I want it to have a little bit of a maple syrupy flavor to it. But I mean, maybe that's just me. And again, that's something that's entirely subjective too. One of the things that I've participated in for many years, back in time, not recently, but was that the mead and wine and brewing competition that we did at Trilliums, or the Trilliums. And that competition is entirely a personal preference competition. You're making something that the masses will like. So I've seen all kinds of different things win there that wouldn't necessarily win at an arts and sciences competition because you couldn't necessarily document them or they weren't documented. But it was, I love this. It tasted wonderful. Yay. We do the same sort of competition at Huntsman's Harvest in the fall, which again, we won't be doing this year, but hopefully we get back to normal soon and we can all get back to living the dream.
I absolutely agree. I think that might be a good spot to leave it. Thank you so much. I love listening to people who are passionate about a topic. I'm really glad I got to do this interview, and thank you very much for your time. And
Absolutely.
I hope to see you soon.
Well, at least we can see each other virtually for now.
For sure. All right.
Hopefully we get back to it soon, and I hope that you, your family, and your friends are all staying safe and healthy.
You too. All right.